first of all, I am from Jamaica, and it's really important to note that I am from sea level, so it's really high up here. So if I'm just talking and I suddenly start doing the Mortal Kombat, fatality animation, of like, please come and save me, But yeah, so this is building your front end with intention, architecture and tooling for your next project. As you can see, first of all, I was really kind of flabbergasted to see how big my face is on this thing. But yeah, so as we said this a bunch of times already, I'm from Kingston, Jamaica, been a front-end engineer for a couple of years now, worked on enterprise, startups, and open source projects. And yeah, I'm also the founder of Tech is Hiring. So if you ever saw like a goofy person during the pandemic asking, hey, you mind if I retweet this tweet with Tech is Hiring? That goofy person is either me or Andrew Haskell. He's a Golang engineer. I think he helps run Boston Golang, but we both went around and did that. But yeah, so we pretty much promote jobs, job seekers, and job resources. Yeah. So front-end complexity growth is really sneaky. It's very easy to like get onto a project that you weren't really, if you weren't really putting a lot of effort into good design, like several weeks later, it gets to a point where it's like doing anything is just difficult. Everything comes to a grinding halt, and it makes you look like this cat. This cat is so upset. Like I love this cat. Like, every time I see him, he's just like, his face is like, I'll get you next time, Gadget. Next time. It's so hilarious. I'm sorry, I love this cat. So what options do we have to deal with front-end complexity? So the main thing we're trying to do is mainly just encourage a more loosely coupled architecture. It makes handling complexity easier, but more importantly, what it does is it makes making changes a much more frictionless experience. So that's what we're trying to do. We were going to leverage some simple things to attempt to get to that point, which is like atomic design, functional and atomic CSS, separating presentation and business logic, and then unit/isolated testing. So atomic design is pretty much a framework for doing component-driven design. And if you don't know what component-driven design is pretty much like thinking about the components that make up your UIs, thinking about building them first rather than building them from the page down. Right? And atomic design is a way of defining that relationship. For those who know, atomic design was first talked about by Brad Frost during a very famous very famous talk that you can find on YouTube. And he talks about like having these components with the relationships of atoms, molecules, and organisms, and how they relate to each other. So just show a couple of examples. So this is the Tech is Hiring job resource app, which just came out recently. I was doing a little bit of work on it. But if you see, like, the highlighted portions are pretty much just like, those are atoms. Atoms are the building blocks of your components. They tend to not rely on anything else. I want to kind of point out to the right that this button, some people don't think of it as an atom. I personally do. But for the most part, we have typography here, the header, and then this just normal text, and then icons and this header for the category, right? And then you have molecules, which are usually made up of atoms, right? So as you see here, is you have, again, the header text and the standard text, but as you put them together, they make a molecule. And again here, you have the icon and the books header. When you put them together, they make a molecule. And I also want to quickly point out that this button is not highlighted because organisms are a collection of molecules and atoms, right? And so now we have an organism, this is a header component, and then this is where the job resources kind of live, right? And so another thing I want to point out is as you tend to go up these levels, the use cases become much more specific. As you can see, like the header, it's very unlikely that you'll use at least this specific header elsewhere in your application. So why does any of this matter? Like, why do we care about any of this stuff, right? So I will explain that with a quick story. So I built an onboarding flow twice. Not twice, but I built an onboarding flow for an organization for two different applications. And I used two different, and so for the first onboarding flow, I came into a project and just needed to build an onboarding flow, and it took a couple of weeks, and it was a bit difficult. A lot of it was just me trying to figure out what knobs I could turn, and what knobs I shouldn't turn to keep the thing from blowing up, and it was a little bit difficult, right? And then the second time I built an onboarding flow, the project was built in Atomic Design. It was a greenfield project that I was heading up, and so I remember specifically that it was a Friday. Right, Friday at 12 p.m. And I was just like, okay, the last time I did this, it took forever. So let me get started on it now. Let me just, let me at least by the next week, I'll have a good portion of stuff done to be able to get this done in a reasonable time. So sat down, worked on it, kind of went through, and then all of a sudden it was 4 p.m. and I kind of looked back and I was like, okay, what else? What other work do I need to do? And I was like, wait, why does the app look like, why does this page look like the mock already? And it was just, all of my decisions just kind of came out, right? There wasn't much problems. In fact, there wasn't really any problems at all, which is why I just completely forgot how long it took. So I should mention, I say 6 hours here because there was times I had to, go back, like do code review and stuff like that. So I'm a little bit more generous. But yeah, it just felt so frictionless to work on this. And so why was this development this easy? Right? It was really easy, partially because a good portion of the components were built out. But the main thing about Atomic Design and just really modular systems in general is the kind of plug and play Legos aspect. And the Legos aspect is really like, you see it a lot in front end with this, right? With Atomic Design. You just kind of plug the components you need in, and then maybe you do some customization, and then you don't even have to, like, if you have confidence in the component, then that's it, right? Like, so it's so much easier to think about the things you're leveraging. And it wasn't even an isolated incident, right? So like we brought on somebody because we needed to get a project out quickly, and a lot of the times you will hear it's like, oh, if you bring on somebody, it'll take, you won't get the time savings that you're expecting because you have to onboard the person and all of that, right? And for this case, it wasn't nearly as difficult. One, I just had to explain to them what Atomic Design is, but the crucial part is outside of the aspect of, they have the kind of Lego blocks, they have the predefined components, is that they only really needed to engage with certain parts of the code base, right? Because they only needed to really engage with certain parts of the code base, they didn't have to learn the entire code base before they were able to add value. And they added value fairly quickly. And that really stuck with me. It was a very unique experience. A lot of times on projects that I was on, it was a lot harder of an experience to just kind of work on front-end applications. So the next thing we were going to talk about is functional and atomic CSS, which is pretty much varying CSS paradigms that focus more on, how do I put this? Focus more on small CSS classes that are usually action-oriented, right? And then you apply those CSS classes to your markup. So in traditional CSS, the way we would do this is we would have our markup, we would label we would tag the markup with like an ID or a class, and then we would probably have to go make this, we define the styles in a style sheet, usually very separate from the component, and then we have to we have to get the selectors and then apply the styles that way. So in functional CSS, and trigger warning, this is a Tailwind. This is Tailwind CSS for people who really do not like Tailwind. In something like this, we are literally just applying classes. Predefined classes is the most important part. They're predefined classes that you apply to your components. And so like in this example here, we have font bold, and it's applying the action of bolding all the fonts, Again, why does any of this matter, right? Well, it matters because it's easier to reason about the CSS that you're applying, because it's right there. It's, like if you want to change the CSS, you get rid of it, you apply another style, right? So it's significantly easier to reasonable, and more importantly, it's applied directly to the component. It's right there on the component. I'm pointing at it like you guys can see it. It's right there. Ooh, I don't want to do that. It's right there on the component. So it's just like, it's easier to just like, okay, this is the CSS that I'm applying, right? And so also errors tend to be isolated to the components themselves or their neighbors. So, this potential error, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, I didn't do this on purpose, lol, right? This is only isolated to this component. So these components have the same definition. Obviously, they're the same thing, just mapped out. But again, the erroneous CSS is right here. Obviously, it's highlighted, right? It's right here. And so if I want to fix this error, I just delete this, right? And then say, for instance, I don't know where this component is. It's like you have hundreds of components. You have no idea what is causing this error. If you have like a functional CSS, if you have functional CSS on your components, you can just literally take the class name and then search through your code base and find the erroneous CSS. And you don't have to worry about this CSS or this error being, or not even necessarily the error, but making changes here affecting the rest of your application. And it just it gives you significantly more confidence in working with your CSS, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about separating presentation logic and business logic. And before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about what they are. So presentation logic is pretty much any piece of code that, that displays data on screen. So HTML, CSS, native code, what have you, right? And then business logic is any code that facilitates a business function. So if you imagine like almost said esports, if you imagine an e-commerce application where you're adding items to a cart, or you're retrieving data in a particular way, or you're manipulating data, that would be considered business logic. So I want to show a quick example of when the problems you have when you co-locate presentation logic and business logic. Does anybody have a problem reading this? Anybody have an issue with reading this? All right, cool, thanks. Much appreciated. All right, cool. So this is from a project that I work on. It's just a side project. It's the engineering sandbox. And the component is silly enough, is cute animals. I retrieve images from the cat API. Leave me alone, I like cats. But so we have a component here, and it's doing data fetching. So I should make a note that the actual fetch that is being done is being defined in another file, but like a lot of the managing of the fetch is being done through React Query. And then we have some markup here for displaying the data, right? So the problem is that I wanted to render this component in Storybook. And so if anybody doesn't know what Storybook is, it's a way of documenting your components. But the thing is, when it renders this data, it doesn't care what kind of code is there. It's just going to run all the JavaScript in this file, which includes all the logic of fetching all of this data. So in this case, it's not too bad, but you can imagine, say you have a Storybook instance that you want to deploy somewhere, and then that component with the business logic in it is fetching from from an API that you don't have access to wherever you deploy the Storybook, right? And so now that's going to fail every time Storybook tries to render that component, So how did I end up fixing it? It's pretty much simply splitting out the component. So I just put all the business logic in a single component, and then it renders the presentation logic, which is defined separately. And y'all can make fun of my props; they're not great, but yeah, that same business logic, mostly unchanged, is here. And then I have the presentation logic here, right? And so, I don't have to worry about it. And so this is the actual story that, that I ended up defining. And all I had to do was really just mock some data and then pass it into the presentation logic. And now I don't even have to ever worry about the business logic being run by Storybook in like a sandbox, right? And potentially doing silly things, right? So what benefits does this have for us? So it's like better organization of files, like as I was mentioning, my fetch files were elsewhere. Usually, people put them in a lib folder. The code is, again, easier to understand and reason about. You're only thinking about what the presentation logic does or what the business logic does, and then it's easier to build a more robust test suite. So like in the previous example where I had the presentation logic and the business logic co-located, if I wanted to test that, I would have to render the component, then I'd have to do an action, then I'd have to pray to whatever deity that I needed to that I get something that I can test on and then write said test, right? Whereas with everything split out, I can just run the business logic in whatever, right? Or what, like vtest, jest, what have you, right? And then again, like I was mentioning before, it's easier to document in something like Storybook. So unit and isolated testing, which is pretty much testing a single block of code, like a function or something, and making sure it works as expected, right? And this is a quick example of just writing a simple unit test. This is from the engineering sandbox. I'm getting some data from Prisma, and I'm writing a simple test on it, right? So I don't want to go too much into how you do unit testing because there's significantly better resources than myself. Kenzie Dodds has a really good course on teaching you how to do unit testing. But like, why does this even matter? So what? You know what I mean? Like a lot of JavaScript engineers are just like, I hate tests. Tests suck. Why should I write tests? Blah. You know what I mean? So before I go, so I want to talk about like, I was one of those people, right? I didn't want to do tests. The tests sucked, I don't want to write tests. It's so frustrating to write, So, but I had I had a microservice in the engineering sandbox that I want to split out. I haven't gotten to it yet. And so I'm writing a bunch of tests, right? And I just want to make sure that things go well once I start splitting out that microservice, right? So I'm starting to write the test, and I'm like, man, this feels kind of stupid. Why does this part of the code base work this way? And so I go back and I bang it with a hammer, and I come back and I write the test. Okay, this feels a little bit better. And then that started happening more than once. And I was like, why does this feel like this is actually changing the code base? So I reached out to a TDD friend of mine, and I was like, hey, does it actually affect your code, like you writing tests? And they were like, yeah, it can, but it just felt like a really like whatever answer. So I was like, okay, shrug shoulders, move on. So I ended up watching a talk several weeks later, and the person giving the talk said this. Those tests, and they mean unit tests, isolated tests, put tremendous pressure on our designs. This is said by J.B. Rainsberger, JBrains on the internet, and they were giving the talk, integration tests are a scam. I have no opinion on that, but like this resonated with me. This is what was happening, right? And so what happens is those unit tests put pressure on our designs by giving us feedback on what the code base is like, by attempting to write tests for it, and what the difficulty or lack thereof of writing those tests, how that feels, right? And so here's an example. This is a potential code smell. So this is for the engineering sandbox. I'm writing tests on the models. Thankfully, I labeled it properly. So yeah, I'm writing some mocks, Then I'm writing more mocks, and then even more mocks. Like who write all of these mocks? You know what I mean? Who'd write the function that required all of these mocks? It's definitely not not me, right? Like I didn't write this, you know. So, let me not do that. So, like, that's a potential code smell, you know? Like, that doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, this is a massive problem, but the thing is, the unit tests, in actually writing the unit tests, you are getting feedback on your software design, you know? And so you can take that information and go and do something about it if need be, or even investigate it, right? But a interesting thing as well is that storybook stories also apply the same pressure. I just told a story about having to refactor my component because I wanted to render it in Storybook without there being any issues. So this image on the right is kind of giving an example of, and I'm moving back and forth, is giving an example of potentially having too many mocks. And to be fair, I'm just rendering a bunch of images just so that it looks good in Storybook. And then passing all this data down. This is actually literally what I just showed a minute ago. But again, like storybook stories are writing storybook stories are putting pressure on our designs. And so we have to think about how the component is designed and how we want it to be and whether or not we want it to be in the way it is, right? And so, yeah. And that's pretty much it. So I just wanted to recap really quickly. So we talked about atomic design, which is pretty much, what was it? It's pretty much like a component-driven design framework. The idea is that you think about your components in the ways of atoms, molecules, and organisms. Functional atomic CSS, which is pretty much very targeted, is very targeted CSS classes, usually action-oriented, that you apply to your components. And then separating presentation logic and business logic, which is self-explanatory, and unit testing and isolated testing. And yeah, thanks for attending my talk, and now go out to make your front-end code bases even more joy to work in. Give me a second. Yeah, so I just want to just talk about some of the repos that I used that have some of these ideas. If you want to take a look, so this is the Tech is Hiring resource app, the Engineering Sandbox app. Feel free to scan those QR codes if you want to take a look at seeing these ideas in action. And then I want to give a special shout out to Rizal and Carmen, who helped me really make this talk. They run a Twitch stream where you can practice like conference talks like this one, and a lot of the ideas are born on that stream, especially the name was born on the stream. And then Jeff, who is a Mozilla employee, who works, I believe, on the iOS app, he really mentored me through putting together this talk. And so if you want to find me on the worldwide internet, you can find me at Twitter, Chad_R_Stewart, and LinkedIn.com/ChadRStewart. Feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk more about front-end architecture, or if you just want to come out and say, no, all of your ideas are wrong. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm also looking for my next opportunity, so feel free to reach out to me about that. And then there's Tech is Hiring, at Tech is Hiring on Twitter, and LinkedIn.com/company/Tech is Hiring. We just released a job resources app, so if you're looking for your next job, there's some resources there that you can at least start with, right? And if you've been on the job search and you found things that were really helpful to you, you can also submit the resource at the app, and it will just really help the next person on their job search. So thank you so much.